Hi, and welcome to Unit 2, Lecture 2. Today we're going to actually be diving into the first of our actual philosophical readings. That is actually finally getting to the meat of what makes this a philosophy class. So, just to give you a little bit of a roadmap for what we're doing today, I'm going to be following this procedure both for this reading and for most of our future readings. First, what I want to get into is the big picture of what our reading, that is, Morality is Relative by Ruth Benedict, how it fits into the larger context of the debate that we talked about last time, as well as sort of give us an outline and an overview of the purpose of our essay, as well as a step-by-step version of our argument. Then I want to actually go into the depth of that argument and look at how each step reaches and moves towards that goal that we just talked about. Lastly, rather quickly, I want to go over how the argument can cover both skepticism as well as moral relativism, and then actually give a few different ways that you, on your own time and with your own thinking, can evaluate the argument and see whether or not it's a good one. Remember, I'm not going to be telling you what to think, but rather how to go about thinking about it. So, just as a recap for last time to give us some big picture stuff, remember that in this unit we're focusing on ethics. We're talking about questions of right and wrong and investigating the fundamental ideas and concepts of morality. In particular, in this class, we're going to be focusing on the question of whether or not morality is objective or not. That means that our focus is going to be on moral norms and standards and whether there actually are such things, whether there are universal or objective rules that should govern what is right and wrong for human behavior, regardless of what people think about it. So keep in mind that our focus here is on what's true, or what people should think, what's right for people to think, rather than what people actually do think. Because that's really more of a question for sociology or anthropology, something like that. And so there are other places to do that kind of investigation. Now, in the last lecture, we looked at three possible answers to this kind of question. One was moral objectivism, the idea that there are objective, mind-independent, that is, belief-independent, moral standards. We also considered moral skepticism, the idea that there are no moral standards, at least as far as we know, and the idea of moral relativism, that there are moral standards, that is, there are rules about what's right and wrong, and they're relative to persons or cultures, rather than being objective and totally independent of what people think. Now, this last position, moral relativism, came in a couple of different flavors, subjectivism and conventionalism, but honestly, the distinction between those two will be more minor compared to the other things we go into. What I want you to keep in mind, though, are the three possible positions and how they might compare against each other. Our focus today is the last of those big three, moral relativism. So this is the lecture and this is the reading in which we'll dive more into that material. Now, relativism states that there is what we can call, or what I'll be calling, moral facts. That is, facts about what is actually right and wrong. And relativism states that there are such things, they just depend on what people think at the level of either whole cultures or individuals. So, it is true that some things are right or wrong, that is, they're normal or abnormal. It's not just that some people believe it, but because it's relative and dependent on what those people think, it's not some just fact of the universe, it's arising out of human behavior in some way. And additionally, there are going to be different sets of what's right and wrong depending on who you're talking about. So we might say that some activity X is right for them, or that it's right from their perspective, or something like that. Now, this is actually a rather common view, especially among people from the millennial generations, and this includes my wife. A lot of very intelligent and very thoughtful people hold this view, but it's also rather widespread among quite a few people. Now, some of the arguments for relativism, the ones that we'll be going over, can actually support skepticism as well. So we won't actually be devoting a separate reading or a separate lecture to the idea of skepticism. Rather, we'll just be including in some of our discussion how these arguments for relativism can actually apply to skepticism as well. Now, the author we're talking about today, Ruth Benedict, will actually be arguing for a version of relativism. Now, Benedict isn't a philosopher. She's actually a cultural anthropologist. But despite this, in this essay, she's actually doing philosophy while she talks about relativism and argues for it. She's going into an investigation of these fundamental types of questions that are the subject matter of philosophy. So even though it's not her profession, she doesn't work in a philosophy department at a university somewhere, she actually is still doing philosophy. But she's going to be doing it from an anthropological standpoint. So it's going to be more reference to empirical evidence about cultures than it will be about ideas and concepts like some of our future readings. Now, Benedict in particular is going to be using a version of what we can call the argument from disagreement. And this is one of the most common arguments you can use against moral objectivism. And most versions of the argument go something like this. This is just a skeleton that most of these arguments have in common. So the argument usually goes something like, if there is significant disagreement about morality, then there are no objective moral facts. There is such significant moral disagreement, therefore there are no objective moral facts. And depending on the version of this argument, it can support either relativism or skepticism, depending on how intense you want to be about it. You could take the idea of there being no consensus about moral facts, to a much further, a stronger sort of standpoint, and say that there are no moral facts at all. Or you can do a slightly more restrained version and say, yes, well, there are some moral facts. They're just not objective moral facts. They're relative to cultures or relative to what individuals believe. But regardless of how it's argued, it's aimed as an argument against moral objectivism, that is, against the idea that there are objective moral standards. Now, to make sure we can actually make a little more sense of the argument, it needs to be really stressed that there's some vocabulary we need to get down. For one, when we talk about disagreement here, we're not just discussing the sort of spats or fights that people have. We don't want to trivialize the kind of disagreement here. Instead, when we talk about disagreement, we're talking about having different beliefs on the same subject. So any time at all in which there are two people that have differing beliefs about the same subject matter or about the same question, regardless of whether it's serious or trivial, then this is going to be what we can call a disagreement. Now in this case, because it's a matter of moral facts, and because it's usually occurring at the level of cultures, the disagreement is a profound disagreement. It's a thing of serious importance to the people who hold it, and the disagreement usually is on pretty big issues. And it's influenced by these massive institutions of culture, tradition, local circumstance. These are things that people can't just give up or, think away. These are very fundamental aspects of the people that we're talking about. So when we talk about the argument from disagreement, we're talking about profound disagreement, and we're talking about there being this profound disagreement about fundamental moral issues, and using this as sort of a source of evidence against there being any objective moral facts, any objective moral standards. So really, this is an argument that uses an empirical observation, that is, observations that we learn through experience and through our senses, and applies this as evidence against, that is trying to count against the idea that there are any objective moral things. Now in Benedict's version, rather than explicitly just talking about moral standards the entire time, a lot of what she uses is the term normal. Now here when we talk about what's normal, we literally mean what follows norms and standards. Rather than average or not weird or the usual circumstances, we're using normal in a little bit more of a literal sense, to mean what adheres to what is expected. A norm is a standard or a rule or an ideal by which you judge other things. The Golden Rule or the Ten Commandments are examples of moral norms. In this case, when Benedict's talking about normal just in general, she's talking about adhering to all sorts of societal norms, or the norms that govern large groups of people. And it's actually entirely possible for something to be uncommon but normal in this sense. A good example actually is something like employment, even in economic depressions. So take for example the Great Depression back in the 1930s. So in most of Western society, having a job and being employed is something that's expected of most people. You're doing something that's it goes against the grain to an extent if you are intentionally unemployed. There's this general expectation, there's this standard of contributing to society in some sense and of earning your own money. But during the Depression, unemployment was a massive, massive thing. It reached into the 30 and 40 percentile, or 30 and 40% ranges, to where a full third of the population was no longer working. So it was quite common, it was not weird, for people to be unemployed. But you might still say that these people were abnormal. That is, they were violating the norms of their society. They were going against the standards that should be governing, or that did govern their behavior. So despite it being quite frequent and average for somebody to be unemployed, these people were still breaking the norms. What was normal didn't change, even though there were large numbers of people violating it. So keep this sort of distinction in mind when we're talking about normal. This is something that I think will help make Benedict's argument make a little bit more sense. And as another matter of terminology, we'll also be using the terms morally good and morally right to roughly mean the same thing. This probably seems like a strange point to make, but strictly speaking, these two are often different. That's a different debate for another time that unfortunately we can't get into. It's an absolutely fascinating subject, and it's actually part of what my dissertation research is in. But, that's just something that we'll have to get into if you're ever interested. I always like talking about it, so if you're curious, send me an email. So, that's the terminology. Let's go ahead and move on now to the actual argument. If there's some of the terminology that's still confusing you, go ahead and pause the video, look back, and that sort of thing. But if not, let's move forward. Now, Benedict's argument proceeds in three main steps. 1. There is significant disagreement about what is normal between cultures. 2. What is morally good is normal. 3. Therefore, what is morally good is different between cultures. Now, this is moving rather quick, but we're going to go into the details here in a few minutes. Now, as a matter of overview, the first step is actually what takes up the majority of our reading, with the last two occurring rather quickly on the last 2 pages. But these last 2 steps are no less important. It just so happens that Benedict, as an anthropologist, is really trying to reinforce the idea about number 1. So really, Benedict is offering us a rather detailed version of the argument from disagreement. She's discussing disagreement on social norms in general, and then in step 2 and 3, it connects this idea about disagreement about general social norms and connects them up with morality. She's essentially establishing that there is a category of things that people disagree about. That is, social and cultural norms, social and cultural standards. She then says that what's morally good is a member of that category. It's part of that thing that we disagree about, and uses that to sort of very quickly and subtly show that therefore we disagree about moral stuff, and therefore what's morally good is different between cultures. What's actually morally right is different depending on what culture you're from. Now, in order to make this make a little more sense, let's actually start going into the argument in detail. So in the first part of the reading, Benedict's discussing and arguing for what we've labeled as premise 1, that there is significant disagreement about what is normal between cultures. Now, she does this by using the observations of sociologists and anthropologists, the people who actually go out and study culture and human society and the behavior of human beings in large groups. Now, she points out that anthropologists have found that over decades of study, that what constitutes normal does not stem from anything universal or objective like human nature, but instead simply arises from individual cultures. You see, much of what constitutes normal is shared among cultures, but not everything, and not all cultures. You see, despite the fact that what's normal is pretty much the same throughout, say, Western Europe or the Americas or things like that, it turns out that in plenty of other situations, what's normal is radically different from what we might expect, especially in the case of small, isolated, and less developed cultures, those that haven't developed advanced technology or are still functioning on the same basic rules that they were several thousand years before, or things like this. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the idea. This is what I mean by small, isolated, less developed cultures. Groups that haven't had much contact and haven't made much association with the outside worlds. Now, if what was normal, that is, the norms and standards that a society adheres by, if these were based on something universal and objective, like human nature or fundamental human rights or the Word of God or something like this, then you would start to expect that they would have similar ideas of normal, because there would be this objective, neutral, idea or concept that they would be using as the foundation of all their other standards. But this simply isn't the case. You see, it turns out that there is actually profound disagreement about what constitutes normal, especially in situations where the society is isolated or less developed or doesn't communicate and share its ideas with the outside world. Therefore, we can start to say that there actually is some real disagreement here, and Benedict gives us a lot of examples of this. Some cultures, for example, treat suspicion, distrust, and the expectation of harm as the normal mindset, that is, the mindset that a person should have. And these cultures treat compassion, generosity, and friendliness as abnormal. That is, the people who act in these ways and have these kinds of mindsets are, in some sense or another, freaks. They're people that are mildly mentally ill or something like that. So, what we have is disagreement about what sort of mindsets or what sort of norms a person should be governed by as their actions and they go about their lives. Now, these cultures actually have deep-seated reasons for believing what they do, and these beliefs seem rational given those reasons. These aren't just random things that show up in different societies, but when a culture actually believes that suspicion and distrust is the normal thing, it's because they have very rational fears about starvation, about poison, and other things like that. They actually do have reasons for their beliefs, but those reasons aren't coming from something universal like a respect for human dignity, or that God told them to, or some things like this. So they have reasons, but they're not based on this neutral, widely available thing. And Benedict goes on to actually point this out quite a bit. If their reasons were coming from this sort of neutral, deeper first principle, an idea that serves as the basis of all the others, then you would expect a lot more consistency. A lot of cultures end up having consistent ideas about, say, gravity or physical objects because they're coming from neutral ground. They're coming from widely available, universal things that everybody has access to, like the observations of the objects around us. But in the case of norms, in the case of standards and ideals, this just isn't the case. Instead, what we're looking at is a wide amount of variation. And this is because, Benedict argues, that their reasons and their norms are simply variations on how a human being could organize society rationally, that they could be trying to fulfill some needs. If they were latching onto these deeper truths, we would expect more similarity in isolated cultures. But instead what we have is variations. And so the only thing that we should take away from this is that there are variations, that there isn't some universal standard. Now, once Benedict has established this, she moves on to quickly, but rather vitally, argue for premise 2, that what is morally good is normal. That is, the morally good and the socially normal, that is, what adheres to social standards, are really the same thing. So Benedict's making a bridge between norms in general and moral norms in particular. So when Benedict claims that Benedict does claim that when we talk about the morally good, or what's right, what's really correct for us to do in the moral sense, what we're really saying is that that activity is habitual for us. It's part of the regular routines, part of the normal routines of our society. We regularly and consistently see that that activity fits with our social norms, and it's therefore expected by members of society. But we don't like talking about habits and that sort of thing. It doesn't make what we do sound very important. So instead, we use the discussion of what's morally right. Morally right is really just a convenient shorthand that most of us understand as being, that something matches up with our expectations and what's approved by society. So take the example, say, of being compassionate and being nice, since Benedict gives us evidence that this isn't a universally normal thing. In our societies, or at least everybody watching this video, I assume, has some sort of standard of that you should be nice and polite and kind to other people. If we take Benedict at her word, what this really means is simply that we expect other people to be nice and kind and compassionate. Not everybody does it, because remember, the definition of normal doesn't mean that it's not uncommon for something else to happen. But instead it means that this is what we expect of other people. This is the standard by which we judge other people's activities, and this is sort of what we've accepted as a society as being correct. But we don't like talking about being compassionate and polite just as being what everybody expects. We tend to try and elevate it to a little bit of a higher kind of thing that we should be doing. So we say that it's good, it's morally good. It has some deeper or more striking importance to it than just following along with our social habits. So, rather than talking about it in terms of habit, we talk about it in terms of morality. Now, if we take this idea and we combine it with the first premise, we can actually try and get the conclusion idea that Benedict defends. So, let's take our premises and combine them, and we get, therefore, what is morally good is different between cultures. Let's walk through this again. If what's normal is different between cultures, and what's morally good is the same as what's normal, then what's morally good is also different between cultures. It's like saying, if all cats are mammals, and all mammals have fur, well then you would also want to say that cats have fur. You've established a broad category, you've established that this other thing is a member of that category, and therefore you can extend the property of the category to the property of the thing in the category. So therefore, in this situation, rather than talking about cats and fur and the like, we can say that there is no objective moral standard or fundamental principle from which we derive moral rules. They're just socially created, because there is wide variance on what people consider morally right, or what is morally right for those societies. And this has the implication that no matter how valued the traits of a deviant might be by other cultures, in their own culture, those people are still deviants. They're still abnormal in some way, because they can't be judged against a universal standard. This is why we might say that this is an argument for relativism rather than skepticism. We know that there's no objective moral standards, but there are still people that violate standards. They're not just free of any judgment whatsoever. So take, for example, our two cultures, one of which takes distrust and suspicion as being the norm, and our other one that treats compassion and being kind as the norm. In the suspicious culture, if you have a compassionate person, that person is going to be a deviant in some way. They're going to be abnormal. They're going to violate the standards of their culture. Now, if there is no universal moral standard, according to this argument, then we can't say that that person is really morally good, it's just not recognized by a society. That doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent with the other things that we've said. Instead, that person is still socially deviant. They still violate the norms and the standards of their people, and we have to be able to say that because there is no universal standard. There's no third standard by which we can say that they're actually compassionate or they're actually morally good. And the same would be true for the reverse for our other society, the one in which compassion is the norm. We can't say that the suspicious and distrustful people who don't help others are actually doing the right thing, because that would again require this third external standard by which we can say one of these two cultures is correct. So, I know that's a lot of stuff all very quickly. So let's recap real quick. Benedict's argument as a whole has three moves. There is significant disagreement about what is normal between cultures. What's morally good just is what's normal for a culture. Therefore, what's morally good is different between cultures. Now, if you don't understand any of these steps, pause the video, write down some questions, feel free to ask them of me at another time, send me an email or whatnot. Or go back and rewind the video, go back to the reading, and see if you can make sense of these steps. Because you need to have some sense of the whole of the argument before we can move forward with these next parts. Alright, so this is an example, like we said earlier, of a version of the argument from disagreement. This uses observed disagreement about moral questions as evidence against objective moral standards. Now it's worth noting, as I sort of hinted at a few moments ago, that Benedict's argument is geared towards relativism, but it's easy to apply this reasoning in defense of moral skepticism instead. Essentially, all we'd have to do is add one additional premise. If there are no objective moral facts, then we have no reason to think that there are any knowable moral facts at all. Now, if Benedict added this kind of premise to her argument, then all of the anthropological evidence she cites could equally support skepticism. That is, the view that there are no standards, as opposed to saying that those standards are relative to cultures. However, Benedict doesn't do this. Instead, she leaves it at the idea that what's morally right is different between cultures. She never takes this additional step, so we can't say that Benedict is a skeptic. Instead, we can simply say that there is a related argument, a similar argument, that could also support skepticism. But because both of these are anti-moral objectivism, we can kind of talk about these at the same time. So once we have an understanding about the actual argument, we need to actually start trying to evaluate the argument. If you remember from our steps of reading philosophy, we need to try and see whether or not this argument's true. We can't just take it at face value. It may be that Benedict is correct, but we need to be sure that Benedict is correct, or find out where she screwed up, where she made her mistakes. So we have to ask ourselves, is this argument, this modified argument from disagreement, is it a good one? And we can actually use our toolkit from that first unit to start identifying a few facts about the argument. First off, if you go back to the structure of it, this is a deductive argument. It doesn't just try and say that what's morally good is probably different between cultures. Instead, it's saying definitively that what's morally good is actually different. And it doesn't say that we've observed a lot of evidence, a lot of disagreement. It's saying that there is significant disagreement. It's acting a lot more, or discussing more, about concrete, absolute facts. And therefore, it seems to be truth-preserving. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So if we're going to identify this as a good argument, we need to be looking at the qualities that belong to deductive arguments, validity and soundness. Now, the argument appears valid, at least as the way that we presented it, or the way that we took it from the reading and distilled it down into steps. Benedict never gives us these numbered steps, but by reading and pulling out the premises, just like you did for your first journal, we were able to sort of construct the argument. Now, looking at these, there's no obvious logical mistake here. It doesn't seem obvious that there's some sort of invalid move going on here. It seems to be the case that if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must also be true. Because 1 establishes a category, 2 establishes that what's morally good is a member of that category, and then 3 just extends the properties of the category to the property of the thing in the category. That's a pretty ordinary, perfectly logically valid move. So there's no obvious logical mistakes here. The argument is still valid. But this doesn't mean that it's actually false, or that it can't be secretly invalid. You see, with some arguments and some presentations, there are sometimes hidden premises or assumptions that we're not aware of that are necessary to make the argument work. And those can actually lead to an argument being valid or invalid. But we're not going to worry about that right now, because what we have is a very short reading, and it seems like we did capture everything that was there. But just be aware that even if you make a version of an argument from a reading like this, it is still possible for you to leave something out, or for the author to have very subtly made a point that's easy to miss. And so even after making an argument in step-by-step fashion, it is still possible for it to turn out to be invalid when you don't expect it. But again, we're not going to worry about that right now. Instead, we're going to worry more about whether or not the premises are actually true. Let's assume the argument's valid, but it still doesn't mean that it's sound. It doesn't mean that the argument's a good argument, that it gives us reason for thinking that the conclusion's true. because it might turn out that one of the premises is false. And if one of those premises is false, then the conclusion might also be false. Or if we were to have independent evidence elsewhere, from another source that the conclusion was false, then we could say that even if the premises were true, then it was a bad argument, because it was trying to lead us to a falsehood. Now, this is not something, whether the premises are true or false, that I'm going to tell you, because again, that would sort of constitute telling you whether morality is objective or relative, and honestly, we don't know for certain. It's something that we have good reasons for thinking one way or another, and surely one of the answers is true, but it's not the purpose of this class to tell you what to think. Instead, I want you to take some of these questions as food for thought for evaluating on your own terms. So, Benedict seems to have given us good reason for thinking that premises 1 and 2 are true. She gives us a lot of evidence that there's disagreement in the world, and she also gives a brief argument that what's morally good is really identical to what's socially normal. But is there anything being left out? Are there mistakes being made here? One thing that you might want to consider is that perhaps we can't understand morality as just adhering to social norms. Maybe there's more going on when we talk about what's moral or what's right. Or perhaps there isn't nearly as much disagreement as we like to think. Perhaps that premise 1 is actually where the mistake is made. So I want you to go back, once we're through with the lecture here, and look at the premises and start trying to think about them using these questions as a guide. Is there something being left out? Is a mistake being made here? Or do Benedict's reasons stand up to criticism? Do you agree with Benedict's reasons? Do you agree with the premises? Why? Actually think about the reasons why you might agree or disagree with this, and make sure you have reasons for that. Now, there's another way that this argument can be mistaken, even if it turns out that all the premises are true. Suppose that this is a good argument. Suppose that it is actually valid, and suppose that after considering your options, that you consider the premises and the conclusion to be true. That is, you think that they actually describe the way the world actually is. So it's a good deductive argument. Cool. Now, does the conclusion then commit us to something else that's irrational or mistaken? This is another way in which we can end up rejecting the conclusion of an argument, even if it's a good argument, because those implications give us a reason to endorse or not endorse a position. So, this is a way that an argument can screw up and cause us some problems. Now, in order to think about this sort of thing, I think a good example is to go back to some of the trolley problems we discussed in the last lecture. So if Benedict's correct, if what's morally right is relative to different cultures, because there's significant disagreement, then that means that we can have disagreements about what the right answer to a trolley situation is, whether or not you should pull the switch, and both of these answers be right, depending on what culture the thing's located in. So suppose that there are two different cultures. One in which human life is valuable, and another in which human life is not valuable. Now, in the culture in which human life is valuable, in which you should try and maximize the number of human lives saved, then the right answer to the spur-type trolley problem would be to throw the switch. That's going to be the action that actually tries to maximize the number of lives being saved. In fact, instead of having never mind. So, in this type of culture, because it's located in this culture, throwing the switch would be the morally right thing to do. Now, suppose there's another culture. There's a culture in which it's wrong to kill a human being for any reason whatsoever. In this type of culture, throwing the switch would be morally wrong, because you're intentionally killing somebody in the same way that you kill somebody, like in the Fat Man scenarios. So, if Benedict's right, it's a direct implication of her theory that depending on which culture the trolley car accident's happening in, there are different answers to whether or not you should pull the lever or not. But to some people, to a lot of people, this is going to seem rather weird. Cultures are usually associated with countries and geographical locations. But why should the physical location of a trolley car on the planet change whether it was right or wrong to pull that switch and to kill somebody? If they were happening at the borders of these countries, then it seems weird to say that if the trolley car had been just a couple of miles west or something like that, then it would be, it would change what was right or wrong to do. That seems like a very strange consequence. But on the other hand, that may seem perfectly logical to you. That may seem to be an entirely consistent implication, an entirely reasonable implication of the theory. Now, the point here isn't that whatever you think is consistent or what seems consistent to you is consistent, but it's more to get you thinking that you should be thinking of the implications of an argument as well as what its premises and conclusions say. You should start trying to consider whether or not it's acceptable for you or for any rational person to believe this thing. If an argument were to try and present us with the idea that there are some round squares out there, a concept that's absolutely ridiculous since the definition of a square requires that it have corners. If a theory or an argument required that we believe in round squares, even if it's a good argument, it's not something we should actually accept because it's trying to require that we believe something crazy. So consider whether or not an argument like this requires some strange beliefs as direct implications. Now, I'll leave you to your considerations here. So far, we've looked over the main argument, we've gone into detail through its steps, and we've talked a little bit about ways in which you can both apply it to skepticism and start to evaluate it. But I leave the evaluating to you. So, I'll see you next time when we continue our discussion about moral relativism and objectivism. Thanks.